So the film I've researched is the 1997 film The Watermelon Woman by Cheryl Dunye. I chose this film because it deals with the theme of our research question in an interesting and provocative way. As the first feature-length film by a Black lesbian, The Watermelon Woman deals with the question of representing the intersection of multiple marginalized groups, Black, lesbian, and female, in a way that has never been done before in film history. As critic George Dirk suggests, Danier is critiquing the film industry from the outside in, quote, telling the story of a person whose identity has no history of representation, end quote. The Watermelon Woman tells the story of its protagonist, Cheryl, played by Danier's quest to make a documentary film about an undocumented 1930s actress, elusively named the Watermelon Woman, who starred as the mammy figure in many plantation films at the time. The film thus centers around revealing the hidden history of a woman who's been excluded from film history, later named Faye Richards, whose work portrays the complicated figure of the Black female slave, the mammy. Salitha Mason suggests that rather than going with film tradition and representing the mammy as a figure of fat, grotesque, asexual Black womanhood, Danier queers the mammy in order to, quote, enable a more complex model for Black women's representation on screen, end quote. By tracking Cheryl's quest to document Faye, the film portrays her as a person worth of study, documentation, and sexual interest. Through the figure of Faye, Danya brings value to the histories of multiple identities, Black lesbian women in film, as well as the enslaved women they represent. Danya's character Cheryl explicitly highlights in the film, in one of her multiple direct addresses to the camera, that the documentary she's making is intended to, quote, write her own history, end quote. This writing is necessary as both within and without the film, the history of Black lesbian women has been hidden or simply not documented at all. This is most evident in how the archive functions in Dagnier's film. As highlighted by T.L. Cowan and Jasmine Rolt, the archival turn of the mid 1990s denotes a move in feminist and queer practice to a prioritization of, quote, recovering, scavenging, and revaluing artifacts or things, and preserving and valuing feelings that tended to be deemed unproductive or useless. Archives would represent the history of marginalized groups, but this history first needs to be found. Cheryl's search for evidence of Faye's existence comes up against multiple barriers. Her local library, an institution dedicated to documentation, turns her away without the resources she needs, and the lesbian archive she approaches is chaotically disorganized and only has one small box dedicated to all of Black lesbian history. This scene allows Danier to portray the race and class barriers that stop people from creating or discovering their own history. This process mirrors barriers Danier actually experienced when researching for her film. Danier reportedly started her research at the Lesbian Her Story Archive and the Library of Congress, but the lack of resources available and absence of funding to further her research led her to stage her archival footage. Danier's economic status and the extreme marginalization of Black lesbian women led her to make Faye Richards fictional. As suggested by Catherine Zimmer, Danier claims and complicates the documentary tradition through this use of the fictional, valuing what Anne Chvotkovich describes as archives of lesbian feelings as much or even more than what is perceived as factual history. In an interview in 1996, Danier states that, quote, although Faye Richards never lived, she is drawn from the lives of many people. Her story, although fictional, is plausible. She stands as an homage to women whose lives are not recorded, end quote. The fictional, therefore, is not untrue because Danier draws on the lived experience of countless Black women to create a character who can represent the complexity of Black lesbian existence. Danier compounds this by integrating herself into the film, making it autobiographical in order to emphasize how reclaiming hidden history is essential to any marginalized filmmaker. Catherine Zimmer's analysis of the film is important to consider here, as she states that The Watermelon Woman works in the tradition of self-reflexive cinema. Zimmer suggests that traditionally, quote, reflexive work, particularly work that seems to address the loss of authorial control by the film director, has functioned to reinstall the primacy of a dominant subjectivity, end quote. This subjectivity is namely a white male subjectivity, as seen, for example, in Fellini's film 8 and a Half. She argues, however, that Dunya is combining a feminist personal women's history documentary with more male narrative reflexivity serves to create a film that is radically constructive. She takes women out of the trap of reality that characterizes factual documentary, whilst challenging the dominant men in cinema, asserting at the end of the film that, quote, I am a black lesbian filmmaker who's just beginning. By creating a self reflexive autobiographical work that is intent on determining its own history and perpetuating a future, Danye fascinatingly revisits and boldly reclaims hidden Black lesbian history.